first and foremost, Josh, I just want to thank you for actually making the time to join us.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, and thank you to everyone who's actually showing up for this. I know everyone's busy, so I appreciate it.
Josh, I wanted to start as we just did our little poll. Obviously, folks on the call, some folks are familiar with your work, but I did want to give you a chance to explain what For the Interested is and how you would describe what you do.
Sure. So, For the Interested is a my free weekly newsletter. I've written it for almost 5 years. It goes out every Sunday. This week is like the 238th issue in a row. It is a curated newsletter that features basically five links and summaries to articles, videos, podcasts designed to help creators produce, promote, and profit from their creations. Typically, the first one is usually an original blog post that I've written, and then the others are curated from different sources. It's grown to, it's funny, online, the number everywhere is 25,000 subscribers. That's true. It's actually shrunk a little as I've cleaned the list over the years, but it's around 20,000 subscribers. And it's the engine of everything I do. I don't directly monetize it, although I do have ads in it. So I do that, but it is the majority of my revenue comes from consulting. I help creators of all sorts grow audiences and build businesses and that kind of thing. But the newsletter, I always say, is the most important thing that I do. It's the engine of all of it. I do no outreach for clients. It's the way I have, it's the central point to where I've grown my audience. It's the way I've met people and built out my network. It's where my clients come from. And it's an incredible tool for me to learn an amazing amount of stuff. I curated thousands of ideas in that newsletter over the years. I learned a lot about how to produce, promote, and profit from creations. Then the other thing I do is I have it's funny, we were talking before we started this. I now have stopped calling it a newsletter, but some people would call it a paid newsletter. I call it a paid resource called This Is How I Do It. And that also goes out once a week. Each week, it is a deep dive into a single topic where I explain and show exactly how I do something to grow my audience, create content, build my business. That's been going for about 6 months. It's done really well. And I know we can get into this at some point about the mistake I think a lot of people make with paid content products, especially paid newsletters. So This Is How I Do It. And then I'm very active on Twitter at Spector, Spector. I've grown my audience. I'm at almost 13,000 followers. That grows pretty steadily. And we can get into that if you want to. I have a whole system. I'm very big on, I think most people don't get anywhere near the value out of the content that they create. So I'm very big on repurposing stuff and trying to maximize the value of it. Most of the blog posts I write, pretty much all of them are evergreen. I don't really cover, same thing with my newsletter. I don't cover topical news. I'm not writing about the thing that's happening today. I'm never going to do a post about Twitter has a new feature because I know that in a week that doesn't matter. So I have posts that I've written 4 years ago that are just as relevant today, that continue to bring in new subscribers, continue to get shared. When you write and create evergreen content, it's just exponentially more valuable. And I'm able to recycle that on different platforms as well.
That's such a great segue into the first thing I was going to ask you, which maybe on some level is impossibly broad, but as you just heard from Josh's background, I'd say very few people who have worked across such a breadth of topics within kind of the creator and online writing sphere, and has really been thinking about this deeply for years. I love that. I've heard you say consistently, you just said it there. One of the biggest values of writing For the Interested has just been your personal learning, not even necessarily all the great consulting and other monetization opportunities. So my big question here, and parse it however you, is what advice or themes do you find yourself repeating most often with the creators you work with and to your readers?
There are a lot. So I'll try to throw out a couple that come to mind. The first is, it's all about providing value. And the more value you provide to other people, to your audience, to your customers, the more value it creates for you. I think it seems obvious, but I think it's the biggest mistake most people make is they have that reversed, right? And just this is a small example, but they treat their social media posts as if they're just advertising their product or pushing their article on people or this or that. And that's not the way it works. If you set out with the goal of, I want to provide people, and ideally a specific group of people, that's sort of niche versus broad. But if you can, so for me, my goal is to provide value to creators. And everything I do is designed to do that. And the more value I provide them, the more value it creates for myself. So that I'd say is one overarching idea. Another one is, one of the things I found from dealing with a lot of creators is that, especially when it comes to audience growth, although this could also be true for just about any struggle they may have, in almost all cases, the reason your audience is not growing, or the reason you're struggling to accomplish something, is because you're either not doing enough or you're doing too much. It almost always falls into that bucket. So when I talk to someone and they say, "Oh, I'm doing all this social media stuff, but it's not going anywhere," one of the biggest reasons is, "Oh, you're trying to use 20 different platforms. If you focused on one, you'd probably have more success." For myself, I used social media for years, and when I focused on Twitter and stopped using the other stuff, Twitter took off because I was able to post more, I was able to pay more attention to it. I was able to engage with people, build true relationships there. The flip side is also true, right? You'll see people who start a newsletter, they publish it, they don't even publish it consistently, they publish it sporadically. It's, I do it 1 week and then I do it 3 weeks later, and then I do another one a couple days later, and then I take 2 months off and whatever. That's a classic example of, you're not doing enough. I saw Ali Abdal, who's a big YouTube creator, had a video recently. I think it was a video where he was breaking down his income for the year, but he had some great stats in there that were about the average number of videos published by YouTube creators to get to 1,000 subscribers, 10,000 subscribers, 100,000, and 1,000,000. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was a lot. So the average YouTube creator who has 1,000 subscribers, I think, has released something like 165 videos. So you have people out there who are like, I only have 300 subscribers, but they've put out 20 videos. Like, you're nowhere near even the average, let alone, like, maybe you're a little below average, maybe you're a little above average, but there is a volume and a consistency to all of this that's required, that's going to help you get better. It's going to help you that's a piece of it. So different people are different. I think the other thing is, you have people who hold back because of their fears, right? I'm afraid, I'm uncomfortable putting out this stuff. They're too hesitant. But usually most problems I've found can be, people fall into one of those two categories. They're either not doing enough or they're doing too much and they're too scattered. And there are very few people, very few creators I've come across who feel like they're not making progress, that don't like, when I say that to them, they usually very quickly know what their problem is. They're either very quick to go like, I know I'm not producing enough, or I'm holding back, or they go, I know I'm scattered, I'm all over the place. And it's usually one of those two.
God, I love that. Yeah, I think James Clear was tweeting about it recently, but just the idea of really, if you feel like you're doing too much, really scoping down and just upping quality in a more constrained sense, and a lot of stuff will take care of itself. One thing I was really curious to ask you about, and again, I know it could be a bit of a broad question, but how do you think of the different ways that a creator, and maybe more specifically like a newsletter writer, for example, can create value? Do you have like different categories or different frameworks people can think about when I know I want to write, I know I want to create value, but like, kind of, what are my options?
Yeah. So there are some on a broad category level, you go, oh, are you educating people? Are you educating people? Are you entertaining them? Are you inspiring them? But I prefer to think of it like this. Like, to me, all value is about transformation. So a person, first of all, has to be for a specific audience, however you define it. That's a whole other thing. But in terms of target audience, It doesn't have to be demographic. It could be psychographic. What do they want? It's not just, oh, I'm trying to reach 40-year-old moms. Maybe you're trying to reach people who want to be better parents. And maybe some of them are 40-year-old moms and some of them are 20-year-old moms and some of them are 60-year-old grandmothers or whatever. So I think the psychographic demographic thing is important. You really just need to think through, who am I trying to help? But ultimately, going back to the value piece, value is transformation, right? A specific group of people are in point A, they want to get to point B. Your content, your value that you're providing them is the bridge. If your content is not helping them make that transformation, if it's not transformational, which by the way, a lot of content is, it's just interesting. Oh, that's a crazy story. If you're not actually helping them transform, get to where they want to go, it might be interesting, which is a little valuable, right? It can be a distraction. It can be an escape and it can be entertaining and it can be all that. It's not that there's no value there, but in general, it's not valuable enough for them to become super fans, for them to want to pay you money for things, for them to want to give you more of their time and attention, for them to want to share and tell other people. So it is not a coincidence that my newsletter, when I say it's designed to help, it's not just here's interesting stuff for creators. It's I'm going to help you better produce, promote, and profit from your creations. What does that mean? It means you want to, your point A is I'm writing blog posts, they're not very good. Your point B is help me get to where I'm writing good blog posts, right? The promote one is I'm making videos, but I don't have much of an audience. Help me figure out how to grow my point B is I have an audience, right? And profit is obvious, right? I'm not making any money from my creations. Help me make money. Those are clear transformations. And the stuff that I write and the stuff that I curate is all actionable, useful lessons that hopefully help you make that transformation. So that's how I think that, and that broad sense of value is transformation is something I think people can apply to just about any niche or anything they're doing. And by the way, I should add one other thing there, that transformation may be for yourself. So you might say like, I'm blogging because, or I'm writing a newsletter because it's an excuse for me to learn. I want to know more, right? I'm the transformation, which is totally fine. You can't then expect necessarily to grow an audience and build a business, but that's not the point. And this gets back into goals and being clear about what you're actually trying to accomplish. There's nothing wrong with creating stuff that you are the target. You just need to be honest with yourself. That's why you're doing it, and not necessarily expect 1 million people to subscribe to your newsletter that you're just writing for yourself.
God, I love that. And you've got my mind racing there because I'm like, I wonder if maybe this is part of what you're saying, but I wonder if there's almost a hybrid version where if you're maybe trying to make this a transformation yourself, maybe you'll have the motivation to keep going down the rabbit hole, writing about the topics that are going to be relevant, and you can almost evolve with your audience, if you will.
Yeah, you definitely can. And the lines certainly blur. And here's another thing that I say a lot of times to people when they're trying to figure out like who their audience is. In a lot of cases, your audience is you 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. The stuff that you were trying to figure out then, that you figured out, that's your audience. Because you've made that. So if you think about the transformations you've made in your own life or work or career or art or whatever, there's a lot of people that are just further down the line where you were trying to figure out how to make those same transformations. I'm on here talking to you about how to grow an audience in a newsletter and provide value to people because a few years ago, I was trying to figure that out. And in a few years from now, I'll probably be talking about something else because I'll have learned other stuff. So there is a continuum there, and you're right. There's certainly overlap, unless you get stagnant, in which case which is also why it's important to keep learning and trying to take on new challenges, because if you flatline, you get stuck in the same place.
God, I love that. Yeah, you've got me fired up here. I also love the distinction between kind of a psychographic definition of your audience and a demographic one. I'm curious I'm curious to hear you elaborate a little bit more on that, and like maybe how you would encourage somebody who feels like I have a lot of interests. I can't quite nail down who my readers are. Do you have any kind of tips or practices for how people can really get a little bit clearer on that definition?
Yeah, it depends. It's a little bit case by case, but I think you want to look at through lines and connective tissues. And again, I think as long as you're thinking about transformations, you can go down that rabbit hole and it'll work itself out. So it's the difference between going, I write a blog for moms, that is a niche. It's big, right? But okay, moms who want, and maybe this is a way to think about it, right? It's like I create a thing for this audience, but then go a step further. So I write a blog for moms. I write a blog for moms who want fill in the blank. They want to get more free time. They want to be better parents. They want to be better wives. They want to start a new hobby. They want to, whatever it is, they want to write a novel. And once you start getting into that, what do they want? Now your niche scales all over the place, right? If you do something that's, I create content for moms who want to publish a book, you've zoomed way in. If you go, I want to create content for moms who want to publish their first book, you've zoomed in even more. If you go, I want to create content for moms who want to be writers, you've zoomed out, right? So once you start, then you can play within that space and start to figure out what is the right size, who are the right people. And a lot of that is based on what do you want to share and there's a lot that goes into it, but that's how I would think about it. You don't just pick the audience, you pick the audience and figure out what they want, which ultimately then segments it further and scale to whatever you want to scale to.
Yeah, I love that.
And by the way, I'm going to go one step further with that in terms of picking a scale. That depends on what you're ultimately trying to do. So let's say in this hypothetical scenario, right? Let's say that my end goal is I'm a consultant who wants to work with authors to help them publish books or whatever, or moms who are authors, let's say, to keep the analogy. I can only take on so many clients. So in that scenario, maybe I go, let's make it just moms who publish their first book, because I don't need a newsletter, a blog, a Twitter account that has thousands of those people following me, because I can only work with a couple of them anyway. So the narrower you go, the more perfect fit. This is the other mistake. Everyone assumes they need a bigger audience, right? Now, the flip side is if I was going, I'm not doing consulting, I'm going to do an advertiser model, or I'm going to sell products or whatever. Now that scales, it makes sense to have a bigger audience. So I might go, why limit it to mothers who want to write their first book? Why not have it be mothers who want to write any book? Or maybe it's mothers who want to do any kind of write. Like that's where you start to play with it. And maybe it makes sense to go after scale. But a lot of people are chasing big numbers and scales that don't necessarily need it, or it doesn't necessarily align with what they ultimately want to do.
Yeah, that was something I was really curious to get your take on, is more or less clarifying what outcome or objective you have with your writing. And I guess I'm curious to get your take on the, do I go big and again try to be the next James Clear or whatever, have a really big audience, or can I be the king of my tiny fiefdom in this very specific niche where I really am the leader and the expert, the mayor, if you will, of my own town? What maybe considerations do you encourage people to take into account when they are thinking through that? Because the default is probably go big, more subscribers equals good. But yeah, how do you coach someone through making that distinction and clarifying where they really want to go with their work?
I think I always try to work backwards. So especially with like social media and audience, like these are tactics you can use to achieve a goal, or tools. They're not the goal itself. So this comes up a lot with social media, where I'll talk to someone, I'll be like, what's your goal? And they'll be like, I want more followers. And I'm like, for what? Like, what are you actually trying to accomplish? And a lot of times, especially as relates to social media, but it's true of all audiences in general, I'll be like, don't even use any of those terms. Don't talk to me about followers or social media. Offline, what are you actually trying to make happen? And once we know that, then it's how, okay, now let's talk about how you can use social media or your writing or your audience or whatever to accomplish that. An example I give a lot is I've done a lot of work with comedians and stuff in the past, and I would talk to them and they would always say, oh, I want more followers, I want whatever. And I'd say, what is actually your goal? And one of them said to me, like, oh, I want to be cast in a sitcom. I want to be on a sitcom. And I said, okay, what's going to help you get there? We're talking about social in the context of social media. I was like, do you think you're more likely to get cast in a sitcom if you have 10,000 random people following you on Instagram or 50 casting directors and showrunners? You need casting directors and showrunners, not 10,000 random people. Once you know that, now let's talk about what can you be posting and doing on Instagram or social media that's going to get casting directors and showrunners to follow you. Because again, it all comes from the goal backwards, right? If they're not sure what their goal is, that's a whole other conversation. Like, you have to have, it can change, but you have to have some idea of what success looks like or what you're trying to accomplish or what you want. So for me, look, my newsletter when it started out was actually much broader. I've niched down to the creator stuff. In the early days, like, I think my first tagline was like, ideas to help you get better at your work, art, and life. That is everything, right? And as a result, it was still good, but there was a lot of self-improvement stuff in there. How to have a good night's sleep, how to whatever, like that helps. And I eventually over time was like, it's interesting, that's closer to a James Clear path of everyone wants to be better at whatever you want to be better at. And I narrowed down to go, no, you know what? I really like more focusing on this creator stuff, which is still big, by the way. It's plenty big a niche. But yeah, I would not say necessarily that my goal is, again, not to sound like a broken record, but like my goal is to provide value to people, specifically creators at this point, even though there's lots of people that benefit from it I always use this analogy of a dartboard, and the bullseye, the most points, you aim for the sort of smallest piece, but you still get points when you land outside. So I'm focused on creators, but I have plenty of readers that aren't creators. I have clients that aren't technically creators. They own a business and they want a newsletter that's going to help. They're not creators in the traditional sense. That's how I think about it. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's sort of case by case. But yeah, that's how I think about it.
No, it absolutely does. I love that story of the comedian who wants to get cast, where, yeah, 10,000 people who can't really help you one bit is not going to do much versus 50 highly impactful folks. I remember
Yeah.
one of the blog posts where I invested a ton of time writing has ended up really just attracting some of the highest quality, highest impact subscribers that I have. And that was really very eye-opening for me. I was like,
Yeah.
that was time well spent.
This is another trick, because a lot of people struggle with who is my audience. Another one I'll give you in the comedian sense, but actually, I'll give you a different example. We'll use a blog as an example. If you wrote a post or a newsletter or whatever, and I said to you, I can get you any 500 people in the world to read this, but they can't be people and they can't be famous. So you're not going after their big audiences. You're not going after like people, but I'll give it to any other, whatever description you want. Are they men or women? Are they old or young? Are they rich or poor? Are they college graduates or not? Do they work in this industry or that industry? Whatever you will choose as the answer to that hypothetical question, you're going to choose the people most likely to enjoy it or most likely to convert to whatever you want them to convert to. And you have to choose. That's all. Target audiences. Who are the people I most want to reach? Who are the people that are most going to enjoy or connect with the thing that I like? And I found that exercise at times can freak people out because they're really like, I don't know. But what it brings to light is the degree to which they have not thought through who their stuff is for, or for that matter, who they even want to reach. It is a question that you absolutely should, there's no right or wrong answer, by the way, but it is a question you absolutely should be able to answer on both an individual piece of content level and on a macro, the things I create are for these people. And if you can't answer it, then it's worth thinking through why you can't answer it and figuring out how you would answer it if you had to.
Oh, that's an amazing question. I'm definitely sharing that one again. That's super clarifying just to even consider that.
And by the
So
way, it came out of, just a quick backstory, it
yeah.
came out of, again, working with comedians who I'd be like, who's your target audience? And they would say stuff like, people who think I'm funny, people who like stand up. I'm like, that's not a target audience. And I would put that to them, and it would then force them to think through. Oh, and one last note on that is, should listen to my own advice because I'm using some of the words wrong. It's sometimes helpful, instead of calling it like a target audience, calling it an ideal audience. Because when you hear target, what you're really saying is these are the people that are most likely to enjoy what I do. It doesn't mean they're the only ones, because everyone gets, this is what freaks people out about niche, right? They're like, but I'm going to eliminate all these other people, and I know they like my stuff too. Like, again, people like my stuff that are not creators, but the people that are most likely to like it are creators. And that's what it's about. Who's most likely to enjoy what you do or find it valuable?
Yeah, love your analogy of the dartboard. I think
Yeah.
that's very illuminating of just you still get points for hitting a
Yep.
couple rings out.
Yeah, it's not all or nothing. When you
Totally.
say I'm targeting these people, it doesn't mean that's all you're going to get.
Exactly. Yeah, I love that. And one thing I think, guys, already flying by because I want to lob a few more questions in here before the Q&A. One thing I was definitely curious to along these lines to get your input on or hear some stories is around how maybe like feedback from your readers has helped shape the trajectory of what you do with For the Interested or your paid or excuse me, not paid newsletter, but this is how I do it. The
Yeah.
paid newsletter information product. We'll go into that in a sec. Very curious to hear maybe how feedback from readers or peers has maybe helped shape some of the direction of the work you've done the past few years.
I definitely pay attention to it. I wouldn't say I'm overly dependent on it. I understand that, look, I pay attention to how many people are opening and what are they clicking, and oh, that link got a lot more clicks than they typically do. I really pay attention to qualitative stuff. Wow, it's interesting that tweet got a lot of replies, or it's interesting that everybody liked that, but nobody shared it. It's interesting that I got a lot of people who replied to this, that, or the other. But I don't overestimate or put too much weight into it, because I also understand that there's context. So taking my newsletter, for example, like, while everything is for creators, one article might be, here's how to grow your podcast. And the next one might be, here's how to get a project done in a week, whatever. The podcast one is only interested to the part of my audience that has a podcast. The other one is interested potentially to everyone. So when the other one gets 10 times as many clicks, it'd be very easy to misinterpret that and go, oh, it's got 10 clicks, I should do more of that sort of broader general stuff. But the podcast one, for the 10% of my audience that has a podcast, it's the most valuable thing they've seen in months. So that's what I mean, where I don't read too much into these numbers, because there's a lot of stuff at play. The broader it is, the more clicks it's going to get. When I'm putting together my newsletter in terms of choosing content, this is another thing. Like, my goal is not to have everybody. So if I share 5 articles in my newsletter, my goal is not to have people click as many as possible. My goal is to have every reader find one thing in my newsletter that they love. Because if they get one thing, that's enough for them to open the next time. So as a result, almost like the way a DJ would with a playlist or something, like, I'm trying to mix it up so that 1 or 2 are broadly appeal to everyone, and then 3 or 4 are home runs for a subsection of my audience. It's also why you'll notice I might find 4 amazing articles about writing this week, but I am not going to have 4 links in my newsletter to writing articles, because I don't want 80% of my newsletter to be writing. I'll put 1 or 2 this week and 1 or 2 next week. Like, I'll space them out. Like, I want that that blend and that mix. So that is, I'm paying attention to the data, but I'm not letting the data dictate. And ultimately also, all this is, again, this goes back to these things being tools. Like, it's designed to help me get where I want to go. And there's lots of stuff I could share that I know will get lots of clicks. But if it doesn't align, or for that matter, maybe it isn't actually that valuable, right? Oh, some guy's talking about a breakdown of how much money he made. This goes back to interesting versus valuable, right? That's interesting. But unless he's explaining how he actually made it and how you can adapt that, how you can learn from it, it's not that valuable. Yeah, that's how I think about it. I pay attention to it, but I'm not dictated by it.
Love that distinction. And it's also a great filter as a reader. I'm viewing this almost with the reader lens too, where it can be very intriguing to click into something that's interesting,
Yeah.
but at the end, almost like eating fast food or something. It wasn't as fulfilling as,
I
it
aim
started.
for actionable content in both the content I create and the stuff I curate.
Yes.
When a person sees this, what can they do with it? If they can't do anything with it, if it doesn't trigger them to take an action or rethink something in their own business, if it's just interesting, it's unlikely I'll share it.
That's exactly what actually I was about to ask next. Something I've really enjoyed about reading your work is, amongst many things, is kind of the economy of words and the respect for your reader's attention. I think you're like a very efficient writer, and you just like, I feel like when I open your email, it's just, I have to sit down because I'm like hooked on every word.
It's my journalism background.
Yeah. Well, truly. Yeah. And I think
learn to be concise.
Totally. Versus where I think a longer form Substack piece from like, fuck, I need about 20 minutes to read this essay. So that's one. But the other thing is actually what you just touched on, which is the actionable. I feel like I could actually go apply this and try it out when I close this email. So the thing I wanted to ask you was basically, how the hell do you produce great stuff every week as a writer, and really maybe you personally create quality content on a fairly regular schedule? Because I think that's very hard to do. And I know you're not only doing the newsletters, you do have plenty of other things going on. Curious if you have any advice or behind the scenes expertise on producing on a reliable cadence good stuff.
So I do. So first of all, I should say the finding of stuff, like how do I find articles to share and curate whatever. From the very beginning, even before the newsletter, I consume a lot of stuff. I read other newsletters. I follow smart people on Twitter. So I was seeing all this stuff anyway. So I don't invest any sort of quote unquote additional, it takes time, but it's not additional time. I was doing it anyway. So when I come across something interesting, I just have a document and I drop it in and go, oh, this might be for the newsletter next week. So that part of it is really not difficult for me because it's part of consuming stuff that I already consume. By now, like anything, you do it enough, you get a sense. I can tell right away based on some of the things I just talked about, right? Is this just interesting? Is it actionable? Could someone do something with this? Does it fit my sort of audience? So I'm able to pretty quickly assess like what's going to go in there. In terms of how I actually put it together and write it, it's the same format every time. So once I came up with that format, I know headline, quote excerpt, basically like a 3 or so sentence paragraph summary. Even that is people don't realize this. It's funny because there's a woman who works with me and helps me with stuff, and she's helped me with all sorts of things and sees the newsletter all the time, obviously. And I told her at some point, I explained to her how I write the summaries because it is in my own mind sort of a template. She had no idea. She was like, wait, they're the same. I was like, they're the same every time. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I actually wrote it up as an addition of this is how you do it. I show exactly this is how I write the summaries. But basically, I pull a quote. I talk about like how I decide what quote to pull and how that relates to the headline. It's all very thought out, but it makes it, from a production standpoint, it makes it relatively easy because I know exactly what I'm looking at. The summary, typically the first line is some version of my reaction to it. So it might be like, oh, this is one of the best things I've seen about how to grow your podcast, whatever. Then the next sentence is usually some version of, I say who wrote the thing, I insert one of a variety of verbs, right? So it'll be like, Stu explains, Stu breaks down, Stu shares. Like literally, I'm just rotating through. So it feels that, by the way, after I say this, everyone is going to look at my newsletter totally different now, but revealing the secrets. But basically, it's some version of Stu breaks down, and then the clickable text is usually a repeat of the headline, right? 10 ways to grow your podcast. Because the other thing is the clickable. I also write for people to skim. I know they skim headline, they skim clickable text. Having the clickable text just say this article isn't going to get their attention. Having the clickable text say 10 ways to grow your podcast, that's for skimmers, right? So Stu shares 10 ways to grow your podcast. Then it's usually, if it's a list type thing that I'm sharing, including blank, I'm pulling 3. A lot of times I'm pulling them from the sort of items or subheads in that article, including choose a good microphone and do blah, 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 whatever. And that's sort of it. And then I have a related link that's just pulling to something from my archive and then on to the next one. So the not counting finding the stuff, which I don't count because I do that during the week anyway, the actual writing of the newsletter doesn't take nearly as long as people probably think. And it's not that difficult because I'm just doing the same thing every time. The intro section is always a few sentences. Sometimes I'll reuse tweets I had posted that worked well. Those are original, but even those are formatted. I know it's going to be one concept, somewhat inspirational, set in 3-4 sentences, and off we go.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I'm rethinking everything I'm doing because I just love the.
Yeah, that's so funny. But by the way, newsletters that every time it's different, like that would be way more difficult for me. What am I going to write about? How am I going to format it? Is it going to be this, that, or the other? I strongly recommend picking a format that it just makes it easier. I don't have to think about. I know every week I'm putting 5 things in. The first one's an original blog post. This is how they're going to be written. Like, I think it makes it way easier. And a lot of people overcomplicate it by free-forming it, which is fine maybe when you're trying to figure it out in the beginning, but it's just easier to know how you're going to do it.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Totally. It's like these creative constraints can just remove all of the stress and friction that I think is very often just inherent in the creation process. You can just bracket yourself, know
By
the
the way,
game you need to play.
I'm the same for the most part. I'm big on like these formats, right? I'm the same with blog posts. So blog posts, I know roughly how I'm going to do it. I always outline them first, which I've also talked about how I do that. And this is how I do it. This is the nice thing about that. This is how I do it. And this is not meant to be like a pitch, although I guess it is, but this is how I do it product is essentially me taking the ways that I do all these things, choose things for the newsletters, write summaries, all of this stuff and writing it up. And it's actually, again, this goes to like value to me and to others. It's really helpful to sit down and to actually write a piece that goes, this is how I write newsletter summaries, forces me to think through how do I write newsletter summaries.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I guess with 15 minutes on the clock, I do want to leave us some time for Q&A. And actually, Sterling, I don't know if you're able to unmute, but I saw your question earlier around valuable verse, interesting verse valuable, which I also thought was really interesting. And I don't know if you want to unmute and kick us off with the Q&A.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Josh. This has been super insightful and wonderful. And I guess building off of what you were just talking about with, I don't subscribe to a newsletter yet, but
I like the word yet.
How do you determine whether something about you and your experience is valuable or interesting?
For starters, I'm never really even thinking about, is this interesting or not? Like I care about valuable for the most part. And by the way, anything that is generally interesting or whatever can be made valuable if you position it in a way that it's like, there's a lesson, there's an action for them to take, there's a something. So I think that's how I think about what is somebody going to do with this information. So do you have an example of something that you're thinking of, if you want to share, but like you have something of your own that you're thinking about? You're like, I'm trying to figure out if this is interesting or valuable or how I make it.
Yes. And I let Compound tear it apart, which was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for doing that. I'm writing a newsletter about my journey learning about investing.
Mhm.
And I don't know how to make this long story short, but basically, I think it's important to talk about how I have received my wealth, but I want to make sure it's still a valuable article and that it's not just like this like pity party, effusively apologetic kind of piece. Like it's information I want to communicate, but I'm struggling with how do I turn it into something that is still valuable to the reader as opposed to just reading this story about me.
Who do you want to communicate it to, and what's the transformation?
You and
I
your
assume
good
you want to
questions.
communicate it to, I'm going to guess. I assume you want to communicate it to people. This goes back to the like people that were like you a couple of years ago. So I assume you want to communicate it to people who are in the place that you were in previously, and maybe they're uncomfortable about their wealth or lack of it or whatever. Again, I don't know the piece, but whatever it is. So the value is I'm writing this for people who are uncomfortable about the position they're in to learn how to accept and become more comfortable in that position. I'm guessing.
I have not said it in those words, but hearing it in those words is very helpful to me.
That's how you, again, that transformation. So then the whole, again, I don't know the piece, but the whole piece now can be organized. I was here. There's a basic story, right? I was here. I was uncomfortable because of X, Y, and Z. I did A, B, and C. And now I wound up here. If you want to get from uncomfortable to comfortable, here are things you can do based on my experience doing them. That's valuable to those people. It may not be valuable to your whole audience, but that's okay. My tips on how to grow a podcast are valuable to people who have podcasts. It's not valuable to people that don't have podcasts. What matters is that it's valuable to someone. It doesn't need to be valuable to everyone, because if you try with everything to make it valuable to everyone, you're going to get paralyzed, because that's almost impossible to do. I would have no idea what to write if I was trying to write something that everyone in my audience would find valuable. Does that make sense? Does that help?
It does. It does. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yeah, that was helpful.
Cool.
Awesome. I did, Sterling. I'm gonna read your second one out because I actually just want to. I was curious to hear Josh's answer, but how long did it take for you to come up with the kind of template, the formula and format for the interested that you feel like really consistently works?
That's a good question. I've tweaked it over the years. It hasn't changed that much. I wouldn't say that it took that long. I'd say more I've tinkered with it more so than wholesale changes. Look, I've had other newsletters before that were more free form and were more like, I knew going into this, I wanted it to be a list of ideas. Originally it was 10. So once I knew that it was going to be a list of sort of ideas, and I knew that, okay, you're going to have a headline, you're going to have a summary. I decided to include the quote excerpt because, to be honest, this is another hack, I guess. If I just pull a quote excerpt, that's stuff I don't have to describe. It cuts the writing in half. I don't have to describe the key point if I just show them the key point. Yeah, so it's evolved a little bit, but for the most part, it was there from the beginning. But that's because from the beginning, I wasn't just like, I'm going to start a newsletter. I was like, I'm going to start a newsletter. I'm going to share these kinds of things. They're going to be summaries and links, so that it gets a little self-explanatory.
I love it. And Nate, I don't know if you're able to unmute, but feel free to take the floor.
Yeah, sure. Hey, Josh. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Nate.
I am not familiar with your newsletter, so I just subscribed. But
Thank you.
I love the idea of having a format, and I experiment a lot with my newsletter. I'm an artist. I record audio sometimes. I post a bunch of different things, and I think part of that is just experimenting to learn like what's going to stick. But once you've found your format, do you ever become bored with that? And how do you stave that off if you do?
That's a great question. You certainly can. So prior to this, I started and stopped newsletters and blogs all the time. This one has stuck. And one of the things that I did that I actually recommend, especially for people like you and people who like to mix it up, is I always say like my newsletter format is strict but flexible. So I have an intro section, and I now have a section at the bottom called my final words of the week that can be whatever I want. So the meat of the newsletter, the 5 article summaries, is a very regimented format. And the overall format in terms of like intro, summaries, classified ads, final words of the week, like that format's always the same. But within that strict format, I've created these 2 areas that can be whatever I want. They can be, the intro is usually short, but the final words could be long if I want it to be. It can be a personal story. It could be a video. It could be like they're free. So by picking a format that includes some space for you to play with, that's one way to do it, to avoid, so I don't feel like I'm doing the same thing every time. The other thing is, because I'm writing, the first item in my thing is an original blog post, this blog post could be whatever I want. And sometimes they're not blog posts. Sometimes like this will be in that space at some point, right? Oh, I was on, I chatted with Stu in Compound Writing, and check it out. So the idea is to come up with a format that helps you, to whatever your sort of goals are, but that format can be flexible. And by the way, like, you get to frame it however you want. The framing is designed not only to set expectations for people, but also to help you so you don't have to constantly reinvent the wheel. So another thing I'm making this up, but like another thing you could do is, if you had a weekly newsletter, one of the rules or one of the things could be the first issue of the month is a wild card. You're going to get 3 issues that are going to be in this standard format, but the first issue, the first Saturday of every month, who knows what you're going to get. You might get a video from me, you might get a whatever. And that goes from, not only does it free you up to not feel pinned in and constrained, it also becomes a cool hook for the thing. It becomes a thing that people are going to be like, oh, I always want to see what he's going to do. So you structure it in a way that benefits you. It's just, I guess what I'm saying is, the structure is there to help you, but you get to choose whatever structure you want. And by the way, you don't have to have any structure. You could just there's not like, there are people that send whatever they want to send. I just think I have found it helpful to stick with and easier to know what I'm doing each time. But yeah, by all means, like, build in freedom, build in wildcards, build in whatever. I had one client at one point that I'm trying to remember this, but I think I suggested to her, it was a podcast. She was trying to come up with a podcast idea and wasn't sure what kind of podcast to do. And we were talking about trying to do something different and unique and not just another interview show or whatever. And I told her, I was like, why don't you do this? Why don't you, like, every podcast, split it into 2 different formats and let people vote on which. So if it's an hour podcast, do a half hour of this format, a half hour of this format, let people vote, and like Survivor style, like the winning one continues and you introduce a new format each time, right? The variety, the wild cardness of it can become part of the hook or the appeal if you want it to. It's just figuring out how to make it work for you.
Love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Fantastic question. Vanessa, do you want to close us out here? This is the question that I meant to ask, because I know Josh is going to have some great insight here.
Hey, Vanessa.
Hey, Josh. Hello. Josh is awesome. We've talked before and he really helped me.
Speaking of podcasts, you're going to, at some point, if I ever get it out in the next month or 2, you're going to get an hour-long consulting call I did with Vanessa, which is awesome. So
it's really awesome. Yeah, my question is just along the lines of monetizing a newsletter, maybe just a few tangible things that we could do to monetize our newsletters.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the specifics of the thing. One general note, and I've written a blog post about this, is I think the way most people approach this is basically charge people for more. So you get more issues, you get an expanded letter, whatever. I actually don't think that's super effective in most cases. In the article, I say most people don't want more, even if they like it. And this is something I learned personally. Like, my first paid newsletter was an expanded edition of my free one. It worked okay at best. I think a much better option is to offer a paid product that is related but different. So for me, my free newsletter is these are curated articles about how to improve your creations and grow your audience. My paid one is This Is How I Do It, which is a deep dive into one thing each week in my business and how I do it. So the audience for the free one is clearly going to be interested in it, but it's a totally different product. And I think, or I have found, at least personally, it makes people more likely to pay for it, because they don't, as much as they love my free newsletter, they're not going to pay for an extra 5 ideas. They don't want 2 emails a week. They don't like that. That's not hook enough, even though they love it. But they really want to know, how do I write my newsletter? How do I write blog posts? How do I use Twitter? Like that kind of stuff. So that is the way I would recommend thinking about it. Of, okay, I had this newsletter, it's drawing in, this free newsletter is drawing people in. What could I offer them that would be different, that would be valuable to them? And in that scenario, like newsletter email is just a delivery device, right? Like that your product might be something else. It might be an ebook, a course, consult. There's lots of ways to monetize that aren't just a paid subscription thing. But if you are going to do some sort of information product, that's the way I would think about it. Cool.
Fantastic. And I know we're right at the hour here, and I will do my best to be our timekeeper and end on time. But Josh, I did want to give, maybe it's now obvious given the conversation, but where should people follow you online? Where can folks reach out?
So they can get For the Interested at fortheinterested.com. And they can, my personal website is joshspector.com, and that's where you can get This Is How I Do It. On Twitter at jspector. And I also, we didn't talk about it, but on Facebook, I have a big newsletter creators group. So if you go on Facebook and search for newsletter creators, you'll see it. There's 3,000 creators in there. It's not a paid thing, it's a free thing. And to be honest, like the community runs itself at this point. But it's, if you have a newsletter, it's definitely, there's people in there sharing tips and answering questions and talking about stuff. So yeah, I'm around. That's where I can be found.
Totally. All the mediums. I think I heard most of them.
If there's anyone that has questions either now or later, like I am very free with advice and love engaging and talking to audience. So feel free to message me, email me, tweet at me, whatever. Like I'm happy to give whatever help and advice I can.
Amazing. And again, I'll give one final plug for the interested, which is like just this high signal email every week that I just have loved in the few months that I've been reading it. Josh, thank you again. We're going to edit this recording, get it live, and share it with kind of anyone in our audience who wants to dive deeper. We'll share it with everyone who was on this call. And I just can't thank you enough for making the time.
Yeah, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Amazing. Thanks everybody for joining. See you at the next one.